Welcome to the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Spring 21 Energy Seminar Series. I'm thrilled today to be able to welcome Jacque Wernimont, Nikki Stevens, and Carolyn Casey, who will be presenting their work on energy pools, creating data visceralization for energy consumption. I'm really excited about this talk for a number of reasons. As you know, this is a collaborative with us at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, our colleagues at the Rever Center at Tuck, the Sustainability Office, and also the Thayer School of Engineering. And, you know, with the Energy and Society mission, we can think about energy in a lot of different ways. We've had a lot of talks that have talked about technologies or different societal challenges, but this idea of visualization and engaging the arts and really helping us have different ways of thinking about and engaging with energy is something that Jacque and her team have tried to do with this project. So I'm going to turn my camera off, let them present, and again, thank you so much, Jacque and team, for being here. We really look forward to this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I, as was mentioned, am Jacque Wernimont, the director of the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement Cluster, and a faculty member in Film and Media Studies here at Dartmouth. I'm going to take a minute to ask my colleagues here to introduce themselves to you, and then we'll get started with a little bit of a short video and then a few images and then some discussion. So Caroline, would you mind going first?
Sure, thanks so much. So I'm Carolyn Casey. I'm a senior in quantitative social science, and I've been doing research in the Digital Humanities Lab for the past 2 years, working closely with Jacque and Nikki. So I'm so happy to be here talking about this project today.
Thank you, Caroline. Nikki.
Hi, I'm Nikki Stevens. I manage the Digital Justice Lab as part of the cluster, and I'm a PhD candidate at Arizona State University studying loosely data ethics.
Great, thank you. So what I'm going to do right now is show you a short video that we have produced and shot by our colleague Brinker Ferguson, who also works in digital humanities and social engagement. And this gives you the ability to see the installation that we're talking about, see it move a little bit, but also hear a little bit of background. And to give a little bit of context for how this came about, we were initially going to do this installation for an Irving Energy Institute event that was scheduled for May of 2020. RIP all of spring of 2020 and really all of 2020 writ large. So this this project in many ways had to have a kind of hard stop as COVID sort of swept through and impacted all of our lives. And that hard stop on the work for this particular project was probably about 8 months. And it was something that we had been developing, Caroline, Nikki, and I together, and then had to just simply set aside, put on hold. And then we've been able to come back into it a little bit and very slowly over the course of the spring. And a lot of that was dependent on you know, how we could work with the COVID regulations on campus, et cetera. Because, you know, to build a big thing requires being in space together, which is not something that COVID has really permitted. And we also had to do some reconceptualization. This was very much meant to be an installed piece that had the ability to have interaction, right? And so that interactive component is something that we've had to think about how to manifest without necessarily being able to do it in the way that we had initially imagined. So I'm going to start with our video here, and then I will come back and we will get into the presentation.
What we have here is a data visualization installation that we have titled Energy Pools. And this piece was commissioned by the Irving Institute here at Dartmouth. And what you have represented here is the 2018 energy usage for the United States. We have 1,013 strands on the exterior representing 101.3 quadrillion BTUs of energy consumed in the United States in 2018. In order to not have to represent this fractionally, we have 10 strands per BTU to equal 1,013 strands. And the different colors signify different energy sources. So the blues are natural gas. The black, red, brown spectrum is petroleum. Around on the other side, we have greens for the range of renewables. reds, oranges, and yellows for nuclear energy, and then gray for coal energy. But we also wanted to be really conscious that the form echoed some of the concerns around energy consumption and our need to move towards renewables in the piece itself. So what you see here in some of these sort of more banded textiles are recycled chiffon or silk from factories that make silk and chiffon garments. Many of them come from India, although not exclusively. You also have recycled yarns and renewable sources, like this is from wool roving, natural wool roving here in the United States. And we have significant sort of bands of this natural wool roving in each of the colors as well. And these are also sourced from all female-owned companies. And so we wanted to have our piece reflect the sort of ethos of the lab and the creators, right, in thinking about not just the sort of alternative way of representing the data, but also thinking about environmental or climate justice and data justice principles.
I came onto this project when Jacque had already chosen that she wanted something large scale, wanted something textile based, and then we worked together to determine exactly what form that would take. And so what you have here is a variety of textiles, and the goal here is to really have people interact with energy data that you might always typically see in a 2D format in like data systems that are kind of like predetermined to have a number of outcomes. You know, typically if you look at a graph, there's only so many different ways that computer systems allow you to make a graph, whereas this, we really got to make choices about how we wanted to present the data and what the best and most interactive way would be. And what I love about this and being right here is that you can really see that and you can feel it and you can feel the weight of it in front of you because it's, I mean, it's larger than I am. And so it goes all around and represents all of the different sources of energy in the US, but the goal here is to really have a big, large-scale installation that is an alternative way of presenting data.
So we wanted to have a piece that would represent some change over time. And this is something that we thought about and prototyped a number of different versions of. And what we came to was that the exterior of this piece would represent 2018. That's the year for which we had, when we started this project in 2019, we had the best data. So the exterior represents the state of affairs in 2018. And then the idea was that we wanted people not only to sort of look at it and think about the proportion of energy that came from different energy sources, but we wanted them to put some work into thinking about energy transitions for the future. But what we plan to do is to use the IPCC's recommendations for capping carbon emissions and keeping global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And so in order to do that, a certain amount of, in this case, petroleum has to be sort of closed out of the system. And so we're going to ask people to braid these sections as a way of representing, right, the closing off of that particular energy source. And then what you have behind and inside are strands that represent the rather dramatic change, actually, that we'll need to see in order to reach that IPCC goal by 2030, which is a shift towards renewables. So it runs all the way through the piece, and we will do a significant amount of braiding to make this visible. But what you will see is that there will be a 49% representation of renewables in 2030 once this whole piece is transformed.
Whoa! Sorry for that slight snafu in sharing there, everyone. Let me now pull up a different screen here that's got our presentation in it. Okay, how shall we advance you? There we go. I want to just give a quick overview of some of our inspirations. We had a number of inspirations for the sort of visual representations here in textile art. You've got 4 different selections here from left to right, the work of Sheila Hicks, Ann Wilson, Yasuaki Onishi, and Andrea Bowder were all things that we had in mind as we were thinking about this project. Also some of the work of scholar, artist, engineers. So the topic or the sort of framework for data visceralization is one that has been around for not a terribly long time, but a little bit. Kelly Dobson had a data visceralization group at the Rhode Island Institute, or the Rhode Island School for, RISD. I'm trying to figure out, I actually have it backwards here. Thank you. Yeah, for design. Institute and School for Design. Thank you, Elizabeth. Luke Stark had a piece in The Atlantic in 2014. Luke was actually a Newcomb Fellow here talking about data visceralization. And so here on the left-hand side of the screen, you have Kelly Dobson actually at an event at Brown University talking about a prototype for a data visceralization piece that would allow people to connect over distances. And on the right-hand side, you have a piece that was done by Jessica Ryko and I called The Living Net, in which people could sort of materially feel, there was a haptics running through that net that we hand wove there, materially feel the amount of data that they were sharing on their phones. So we've been thinking about what it means to engage with data, right? And if data visualization, and here I'm drawing on Kelly Dobson's work in particular, is a kind of perspectival representation of data that is 2D, it's optically received, right? Data visceralization, as opposed to visualization, foregrounds information in ways that are physically experienced, right? Whether that's through haptics, touch of other sorts, smell, hearing, etc. And when Luke Stark has talked about this, he's talked about the fact that data sets could be viscerally engaged, and that would create a more holistic process of individual decision making, and that process would be grounded both in our thoughts and in our embodied practice. And those were things that we wanted to think about for this project. Here we've got a list of the folks who were participating. As you can see, we had 3 students who were engaged with the project, including in the transformation part, and then Nikki Brinker and I, as mentioned earlier. And I want to give you a sense just real briefly of the installation in progress. So you've got a couple of images here as we started to build up the installation. It's a 15-foot tall installation, and it runs roughly 4 feet by 2 feet as a kind of rectangle. And it was initially hollow on the inside, which you're able to see here in that center image. Once Caroline and I got to the spot where we understood that what we wanted to do was have the energy transition, sort of like thinking about the future as embedded inside of the installation itself, we hung an additional 400 or so strands to represent that energy transition. And you can see in these pictures on the left, right, both our energy transformers at work, but just how dominated by petroleum and natural gas the front of the piece was. On the right there, you've got the partially transformed piece. And then here on the left, a fully transformed piece. And I wanted to give you a side-by-side of the sort of where we started and the full transformation, so that you could have some sense of how that process of engagement worked, what it meant for the group to literally sort of bring the future of energy production forward, right, to the front of the piece through the textile work and the handwork. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Nikki, and I'm going to stop share so that Nikki can be on the screen, and Nikki and Caroline, and ask them to talk a little bit about their process and experience of this doing this work.
Well, thanks, Jackie. So my approach to this is deeply grounded in my own disciplinary alignments. And so I'm a software engineer. I'm studying data models. I'm in an STS department, a science and technology studies department, right? I'm not an artist. I'm not a scientist. And so in my career, as I've been thinking about data, as I've been thinking about energy, I think about how much energy the apps I build are drawing, or the server rooms, right, I'm in are drawing. And that's sort of like the only connection that I've had to energy before this, other than abstractly and intellectually knowing that it's really important. And so for me, part of my early work was trying to figure out how to, first of all, how to understand the landscape. And we did a lot of talking about like, what do these words mean? Where do these things come from? What are the things that based on my discipline, I have the most access to? And a lot of my experience with data visualization, right, is kind of taking data and running it through a computer and making information. And for me, it was a real struggle to think about how to take that data and turn it into something that can be touched. And it was really enriching to spend a lot of time in conversation with Jacque and Caroline and other folks in the lab thinking about what does it mean to sort of touch energy, and what does it mean to think, how can we sort of think with our hands about the transformation? And so a lot of the early prototyping was that, like, and thinking about my own experience of, does touching this connect me to, where this energy is coming from or how it's affecting my surroundings? I think I'll stop there and hand it to Caroline.
Sure, thanks, Nikki. Similarly, I kind of came into this without a background particularly based in art or particularly based in energy. And like coming at this from a QSS background at Dartmouth, where I've learned a lot about like using R to do visualization. Some of my earlier work in the lab was working on a project called Eugenic Rubicon, where I was visualizing the history of forced sterilization. And through that experience, kind of, I think, really developed in my like kind of thoughts and critiques of using like R in particular, because that's where I've worked the most, for displaying really sensitive data, because you had these rich data sets that were super complex, and then you had a very limited number of ways that you could visualize them, and really like the number of ways that you could visualize them were the same ways that you're visualizing any other data, and so it didn't feel unique to the information, which had such a weight. And this, I think, was a really wonderful opportunity to kind of apply a lot of things that I'd been thinking about with data, particularly about the need to be unique, to present it in different ways, to make it like really real to people, and like real in like the sense that like the way that you're presenting it, as Jacque's explained, like reflective of the type of work that you're presenting on. So like using materials that reflect the changes that we hope to see in energy and the ethos of our lab was really incredible. And then also as an undergrad, just working collaboratively with a professor, and getting to be involved in design decisions was, I thought, really wonderful. And I guess the only other thing that was really coming to my mind thinking about, how I would talk about this at an Irving Institute talk was the fact that, I think it's really intimidating, particularly with energy data, to be someone who doesn't have a really strong scientific background, but wants to contribute and wants to be involved in this. And thinking about the scale of the energy crisis and the work at hand, I think it's really, in my opinion, important to make this in like an open space as much as we can, where you have not only scientists involved, but people from a variety of disciplines and a variety of interests coming in and using their own skills to think about the issues, to draw attention to the problems at hand, and think about the scale of the energy crisis. And it was really incredible to be particularly working with embodied, kind of its embodied work. So like spending all of my time, it felt like for the past few weeks, like looking, particularly like petroleum, like spending so much time hanging black like strands on our grid, it really sits with you in a way that I don't think you get when you're coding, how like how much of our energy comes from petroleum and how much work it will take to change our energy systems. And so it's been a really incredible process, and I think I could go on for quite a while about all the ways that it's been unique, but I will pass it back to Professor Wernimont.
Yep. Yeah, I can hop back in. Drawing on this thread that Caroline has developed about the kind of embodied knowing and the experience, right, of literally hanging hundreds, if not thousands, of strands of black, right? There was something for me that was really interesting in that this in part because the work was so compressed. And also, right, it's manual labor to do a lot of this, right? We hung every single individual strand. I have a muscle memory of the state of affairs for energy usage in the United States in 2018, right? I also have a slightly different muscle memory, like in my shoulders, in my back, in my tippy toes for times when I had to stretch up on a ladder, right? I promise I was safe, OSHA. I have muscle memory of the green transition also, right? And what it would take. And I think that for me is part of what the notion of visceralization is about, right? And then as a feminist data visualization or visceralization practice, I was really struck by what it meant to sit with textiles that would have otherwise ended up in landfills, right? With the exception of the wool roving, right? But certainly the recycled materials, or could have ended up in landfills. To think about the workers who had, so if anyone hasn't seen what's known as chiffon ribbon, right? It's hand stitched, perhaps not hand, but by a machine, right? It's maybe an inch to an inch and a half wide strips of off discards, right? Offcuts that are then stitched at that like 1 inch bit in order to make these long strands that can then be used in weaving or other kinds of textile projects. It's kind of it's fiddly labor, right, to put that together. And so I kept thinking about the people who were doing that labor, right, and what it meant for them to be sitting in spaces full of these textiles. And I can tell you that in addition to my muscle memory of the project, I have like a mucosa memory of the project. I would have tiny fibers in my eyes and in my nose and in my throat, right, which I think, sort of brings to mind the conditions of production, right? But also the conditions of dissolution, right? The sort of disaggregation of these materials. And I could smell people, right? I could smell people and I could smell animals. So I would open up the packages of the little haunches or bundles of textile that I would get, and different smells from different places sort of greeted me. And that, as a way of thinking about a kind of community that is connected, right, was a really strong visceral experience, right? And it's one that if you all were able to see the piece in person, you would also get, right? Like you can not only touch. I really wanted to make something that people could touch, right? The artist inspirations that we have produce beautiful works, but they're not meant to be touched. I wanted something that people were actually actively encouraged to touch, but you can also smell, right? And you can hear, you can see, I don't know if you saw in the video, right? But like, there's a great deal of static electricity in that space, enough that like my hair is kind of like reaching out for some of those textiles. So I think there were really interesting things that we learned that weren't precisely about energy, but were associated with energy and with the circulation of goods and of a kind of connected planet that struck me as really deeply important. Also, I can say, having not having not set aside the time to read IPCC reports or other, UN reports on climate change, being sort of conversant but not necessarily deeply read, I know a lot more now about joules, kilojoules, BTUs, quads, right? The division of energy sources, the breakdown of that material. And I would suspect that Caroline and Nikki would say the same also, right? The occasion for creating this piece was also an occasion to become much more conversant in some of those energy conversations than I had been before. Would you agree, Nikki and Caroline, with that?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And like I mentioned before, my main thinking about energy is all of the stuff that I build, right? And and all the energy they're consuming. And so this has really connected me more with the urgency of thinking carefully about the apps that I build and the power that they're using, and even where that energy is coming from, right? And the choices that I make to store big files, because I know that, the storage and maintenance of that data is going to take energy. So it's made me a lot more thoughtful.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. And also kind of a little bit relatedly, but to Professor Wernimont's point about kind of the process, I think it was also really wonderful to be able to like talk through it with people. So kind of coming out of a year of being really isolated, having, a few people come in the lab and see the work and then explaining it to them. And really, like, I think that you have conversations that you wouldn't normally have by talking about, what each strand represents in terms of energy usage. And, like that's a different conversation to have as opposed to just kind of like general conversations about like and the energy crisis or the need to shift towards renewables, because you're talking specifically about the energy usage. And then also just being in there and doing the work I found to be wonderful in terms of like community and like spending time, because it was, I don't know, I think there's something really wonderful about working together with people and doing that kind of like manual work, braiding and tying, while like spending time together, was a really cool way to go about it.
So I think we'll go ahead and stop our sort of formal comments there in order to make time for the Q&A, which Elizabeth, I think you might be able to help us facilitate that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the super presentation. I have really appreciated this project from the get-go. And as you said, we originally commissioned it for our Investing Our Energy Futures conference, which is actually taking place next week. And so having this presentation this week is actually perfect. We wanted everyone to be able to see it and feel it. And Caroline, your comments were ones that really warmed my heart. I mean, just earlier today, our academic director, Amanda Graham, was trying to say, we are also trying to communicate energy to people who might not be thinking about energy. And this whole, the visceral component of feeling energy and how it affected you is exactly the goal of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. So I'm really happy that this project worked that way too. And it just struck me that, textiles are ancient, right? I mean, you can read about them in the Odyssey with, Phoebe weaving there. And energy is also ancient. We used to use oil and fat of animals to light our homes and wood to heat, and how these systems are so often linked in terms of, and as you said before, the current modern ways of depicting as these 2D pie charts don't really let you feel anymore what the energy system is. We've got a light switch, we can turn it on and off, but we don't necessarily have that same ability to kind of think about the whole system. So I really want to thank you for the great project and the great presentation and helping us think about how we produce energy. I think we should have another one on how we use energy, because that conversation that you were talking about, Nikki, with your data science work really made me think, understanding kind of what goes where and what goes here, and how you would think about even changing your control system so you're only using it during these times or those times. I really appreciated that. So please send your questions in. One of the questions that came in with the initial registration was suggested readings, things to think about for folks interested in getting into this kind of installation work. You all mentioned that you'd had very different backgrounds going in. So from our participants' perspective, if they were interested in this, what are some of the steps and readings and pieces that you use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned Luke Stark's piece in The Atlantic on data visceralization, and I think that's a very accessible space to sort of encounter things. Kelly Dobson doesn't have a lot of published work on this, but she has some pieces that are worth looking at. And then there's a really great text that I would encourage everyone to take a look at, which is called Data Feminism. And it's out of the MIT Press, written by a couple of really wonderful colleagues, and brings together a number of different case studies actually for thinking through, or different case studies of engaging data in different ways, right? And thinking about the political and I think environmental stakes of some of those considerations, right? Thinking about how data visualization does or does not racialize, right? How it genders folks, how it forecloses certain kinds of imaginative possibilities. And then, I'm happy to put together a bibliography of things that we have sort of read and put it up on the lab website. And I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to come by the Digital Justice Lab. dhse.dartmouth.edu is the sort of overarching URL for the Digital Humanities and Social Engagement cluster. And we can certainly talk more. I'd love to put together a reading group if folks are interested.
That's fantastic. I have a question here from Amanda, and please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Amanda said, "Thank you for your testimony about the truly embodied experience you all had in producing the piece and how it impacted your energy learning experience. How far do you think the piece can go in sharing that deep experience of energy learning and insight with consumers of the piece who only have brief encounters of it? And I'll braid in her other question because she asks, could you envision a mini braiding and tying experience for viewers of the piece?
I mean, I think that's a great question. Thank you, Amanda. And there's no question for me that the building of a thing is different than the engaging with a thing, right? Because it happened over such a long period of time, et cetera. And Nikki, you can hop in here if there are things that you'd like to add about the various iterations that we thought of. But we went through, before we knew that we weren't going to be able to do a public installation, we went through a number of different sort of imaginings, right? Ways that people could interact with this. And we very much wanted it to be a collective thing. We very much wanted it to be a thing that took some work and some time. And so I think if I remember right, the Irving event was scheduled to be over 3 days. And we wanted to set it up so that the transformation would be enacted by the conference participants. And it wouldn't actually get done until the end of the 3rd day, right? So that people saw that it took work and it took collective effort, right? It couldn't just be done by an individual. Is there anything you'd add there, Nikki?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one of the things that I remember you and I talked about specifically is how to help people connect, not just with the labor of transformation and what ended up being braiding, but how to help people connect with the hard choices that we have to make. Which coal mines do we close, right? And that impact real communities and that have deeply racialized impacts. And so one of the things that we were grappling with, right, is how do we help someone understand that you don't just like swap coal for wind, to use a poor example, right? You close down a community, right? And you displace people, and all those things are part of these transitions.
Yeah, the human lives embedded in this space, I think, is really interesting and important to think about. So the possibility that we could have like a reassembly in the new building, do it over the course of a week with students, is something really possible. And one of the things we've also talked about is if you wanted to do the country of Burundi, you'd see kind of half a strand. Yeah. And just appreciating that all over the world, the amount of energy we use is so different.
Yeah, and actually, as Caroline and I were working on the final iteration, we very much had in mind the hope that someday we will be able to bring this into an Irving space, right, with humans. And so we very consciously made it possible to untransform and redo it, right? So in some ways, yeah, of course. In some ways, the installation is also an invitation to a performance, but a collective performance, right? Rather than a performance by a set of staged actors or something like that.
That's fantastic. And I think you've more than answered Amanda's question about the braiding, but this idea of the recreation and asking different questions throughout and looking at different technologies or policies and how they would change these mixes of colors in different parts of the spaces too. That's fantastic. Here's a question from Dennis Grady. Nikki and Caroline, do you see yourselves collaborating with artists in the future?
I think it really depends. I would certainly love to. This has been like really incredible. I had studied some of the works that were inspirations for Jacque prior to working on this project. It was really not something I never thought I would do, and I loved this work. So if it happens, I would love that, but it's not in the plans for me right now. What about you, Nikki?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had a previous professional collaboration, academic collaboration with an artist before this. And so one of the things that I like about it is that artists like help me understand how little I know. And so I'm really excited. Just like Jacque regularly helps me understand how little I know. So always eager to collaborate with folks who have like deep expertise in things that I don't.
Feel free to put more questions in the Q&A box. Jacque, you're putting sources in the chat. We're going to save those, and when the video is posted for this talk, they'll be in the links as well. We've had some issues before of people posting, but the audience not receiving. And so I want to make sure that people, when the talk is posted, are really able to follow up on those links, because I think they're really important for furthering the conversation. When you were doing this work, what surprised you about the energy system?
I was really surprised. So I should specify, right, IPCC's report that came out in 2020, I think, about energy transitions has a number of different paths, right? They don't have a single a single future that they're mapping. And we chose path 2 for our modeling, which would get us, had a reasonably high degree of confidence, and seemed like a set of things that were reasonably possible within the social constraints. Things that surprised me included that nuclear doesn't change in most of the IPCC paths, at least to the ones that I saw in that particular report. The degree of shift, if I understood it correctly, which I think I did, the degree of shift that would be needed from petroleum and natural gas as opposed to other spaces was a little surprising to me. So I think in my initial imagining, there would have been something like, a equal percentage of each of the energy sources would transition to green, but that's not how that particular path plays out. And so that was surprising for me. How about for you, Karen?
Yeah, something that I knew going into this, but kind of hadn't really thought through, was how, as we're, working towards meeting our 2030 and 2050 goals, and trying to shift energy sources, our energy consumption is also likely going to increase quite a bit. And so thinking through, when we were talking about how we were going to transform, we had a conversation about whether we would represent not only like the transformation proportionally, but also the increase in data. And we ended up not doing that because of kind of constraints of just having proportions and making it kind of make logical sense. But it was a lot to think about and to consider, how much you have up there, and how, like Nikki discussed, with kind of like consumption of data files, like energy consumption. There's a lot, and there's a lot that we're still, as we're making these changes, we're also, doing a lot of things that are pretty energy intensive. And I think that made me want to keep considering ways to make those more, consume less energy, especially with computing, and also like make sure that more of it is renewable. This was interesting.
Yeah, I think for me, going back to like many of the earlier iterations, we had so many conversations about the racialized impacts of energy sources. And one of our early iterations was a map of where energy comes from in the United States. And so I did a lot of work on that map and noticing how energy sources are clustered in different demographic areas. And so for me, a thing I sort of knew abstractly, that energy transitions, just energy is related to like racial justice, for me was really made manifest in making these maps and thinking through like geographically where our energy comes from.
I think there's a way in which, what's not visible here, however complex, thinking about 2018 and 2030 was, and that sort of energy transition, we did a, sort of like the tip of the iceberg, and then the under the water part. There's this huge section of research that we did, and I think a number of other pieces could come out of it, but it really gave me an appreciation for how complex the problem is. Like I knew it in my head, but thinking through the difficulties in some of the forecasting, but also some of the difficulties in social and political stakes, right? And I think watching, from the Trump presidency to the Biden presidency, and feeling what it felt like to represent these energy transitions after we rejoined the Paris Accord versus when we were potentially not, right? So thinking about the politics that go into the politics and some of the technical issues, right? So I know reading the IPCC reports, there was a lot in there about increased efficiencies and things like that. Trying to layer that together with some of those demographic and social justice considerations, right, made it even more complex, or as some folks will say, a kind of wicked problem, one that we don't have the right to not fix, but that is still nevertheless deeply difficult.
Yeah, with the new climate goals that just came out, is a 50 to 52% reduction of carbon dioxide by 2030. Those are the Biden administration goals that they have just laid out. And so that would be a dramatic transformation of our entire energy system over the next decades, with the realization that this is trillions of dollars of infrastructure that often takes decades to build. And so just that like time also that's in those strands that, you're looking at flows, but there's a huge infrastructure there. And the other question I wanted to ask you was, do you see or did you feel kind of the embedded energy, both the energy in the fabrics that you were doing, the energy it took to get them there, the energy in your own clothes? In the making the dyes and growing the cottons or making your fabrics. I mean, there's energy embedded in the world around us as well. The energy that you use, but also the energy embedded. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that while you were working on the project.
I certainly did. I have an entirely new appreciation for what it takes to make clothes, right? Having dealt with, because like the wool roving is a processed product, but it's an awfully long distance away from, say, like the chiffon, right? And so in some ways we had portions of a kind of textile life cycle there, right? And I thought a lot, in part because you have a lot of time to think while you're hanging, 1,500 strands. I thought a lot about, the sort of fast fashion industry and the idea of highly disposable garments. And, we know some of the waste and downstream problems with that. But I kept thinking, because this roving that I was holding, the various rovings are exquisite. They're beautiful, right? They have different textures. They have different light reflecting qualities. They have different smells. And I was like, I have a whole new respect for the animals, right? Who spend a significant amount of time growing that primary product. And I really, I was very conscious of not wanting to add to the environmental burden by buying in new things, right? So that's one of the reasons that we chose recycled and renewable. So I certainly have a better sense of some of the energy that is captured by those processes. As from what I did before. How about for either?
I'm interested that you bring up the wool roving because it makes me think of, so that the roving is really like delicate, like a lot more than I anticipated. So you take it out, like the number of times that I took it out and then the strands just kind of broke apart because there's so much energy and processing that goes into materials before they become, something like a shirt that like is not gonna kind of like break apart in your hands as like soft and beautiful as it is. And so yeah, the process from like that to the dyed recycled fabrics that we have, they've gone through dramatically different life cycles. And I wish people were there with us in the space to be able to touch and feel everything, because you can really sense that more when you're able to interact with everything, especially all at once.
Yeah, I think for me, the main thing that I learned is I'm so used to like doing all of my making through a keyboard, all of my programming, like everything I make goes from my brain out my fingertips and then happens magically on computers. And so I found it really useful to think about how much more care and how much more thoughtfulness is required when I'm using materials produced by people, because I've been so trained that computers are made by machines, even though that's a different false narrative, right? So to be working with materials that I know were made by people, that came from other people's hands, made me a lot more careful and appreciative of those materials.
Well, and Nikki, to your point, and to earlier points about, the environmental cost and the energy cost of computing, like when we're working on computers, we're so separated, I often feel like, from like the environmental impact and the energy consumption of what we're doing, because it's happening far away and like servers and everything else. But here, when you're touching it, when you're the one kind of manipulating the data, it's a different experience, and it feels much more connected.
No, thank you very much for that. And I guess that goes back to the whole theme, which is data visceralization, right? That you feel it in ways that you don't when you're just looking at numbers or reading reports. Somehow it makes it embodies the experience. You've convinced me in ways that are real. While you were doing this, what were some other energy related topics that you thought, ooh, we should do that with this, or we should ask this question? I mean, what were some other things that kind of came up for you as you were just hanging 2018?
I mean, before we even got to hanging, there are the ones that we talked through with Nikki, that Nikki pointed to earlier. And I think the question of sort of impacted communities and also the environments around those impacted communities strikes me as one that I certainly would like to think more about, because there's a really significant racial justice
the impacted communities and the regionalization parts could be really interesting that you both brought up. Yeah, absolutely.
Nikki, you looked like you had a thought.
No, I think I was going to touch on that. And then also we spent a bit of time talking about, can we make people understand the environmental impact of using services like Instagram or Facebook, or, right? So are we having, what is our carbon footprint effectively when we're sending a bunch of content up to Instagram? Which is not to say we should stop doing it, but is there a way we can help? Because it's a thing I think about a lot, right? Is a way that I can help myself think about, how does my massive Dropbox account, right, impact the planet?
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have anything to add to that, Carolyn? Any other energy things you were curious about?
You know, they really touched on it. I think, I mean, there was kind of an endless, particularly when we were talking about mapping things. I think I had a lot of kind of, in my head, I could see kind of much more complex systems kind of move one thing and then you'd see it on a map, or you'd see the change through a lot of different dimensions, which we didn't do here. But it was really, you know, speaking, I guess, a little bit to like being someone without an art background doing this work, I'm not super used to doing work where I kind of start out by thinking like what would be the coolest or best way to experience this, and then kind of making it happen. And I think that Jacque and Nikki are really wonderful at that. So it really like kind of like stretched, like particularly seeing this finished product. It's really encouraging to me and made me want to kind of continue to push and think about new ways of doing things and presenting information.
There was a part of me that wanted to disambiguate the green energy sources, right? Because they're kind of clustered together. They're not kind of, they are clustered together right now. And to be able to think through some of those possibilities. And then I really wanted, as I was hanging petroleum, I was thinking about how the energy justice issues are also health justice issues, right? And that whether it's petroleum or coal, which was, I'm doing this because it was around on the other side of the installation, trying to find a way
natural
to
gas too.
Nuclear, right? Trying to find a way to connect some of that health equity along with energy transitions strikes me as a way that would be really interesting to kind of deepen the effect.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of follow-on questions that you could really imagine having conversations with. If you're saying we're talking about this part, this is what's produced here in Alaska or Texas, this is what's imported from abroad, because it really is a global system. I mean, a lot of the sources in the United States are produced domestically, but this is an international global story of energy movements around the planet. So I could imagine that story being one that we could play and pick on the future as well.
Yeah.
You had mentioned a word at the beginning, haptic. What was it called?
Haptic.
Can you talk a little bit about that and what that means?
Yeah.
I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, so haptics refer to your sense of touch.
Okay.
So things in the case of the living net, we used sound to vibrate the net with the volume of data, and so you could sort of feel the vibrations moving through the net and feel your data sort of zooming away into the internet, which is really strange and creepy when it becomes a whole room full of people, like in that image that's there. Or when you're not surfing the net and still you're producing data and you can feel it and you're like, why am I producing data right now? And that's part of like, you know, ubiquitous surveillance through our telephones. I think the haptic knowing, right, can be lots of different things, right? So it could be feeling your body immersed in a thing, anything that has to do essentially with your sense of touch.
Were there any other ways that you thought that sort of experience could be woven into this or a future iteration of this project?
I think there are a lot. I mean, one could sort of layer in information using vibration to the piece already. I was really struck by what it's like to stand inside of it, because it was sort of hollow on the inside with the green sort of as a back layer, and thinking about like what it meant to be contained by it, to see out through it, right? What those things were like. I'm not entirely sure, you know, what sort of story I would want to tell with a haptic experience, right? But I think there are plenty of them to tell, for sure.
Did
It looks like
Nikki?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask if Nikki or oh, there's another question. Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
question was just about the presentation being available online, and it will be available online along with the links that Jacque has provided. So that will be there. And I just wanted to make sure that you each had time for a final thought, maybe what you're doing next for Nikki and Caroline. And so why don't we start with Nikki, since she's usually going last.
Oh, no, that's okay. I mean, the short answer to what I'm doing next is finishing my dissertation. So I am trying, my goal is to defend this fall, and my dissertation is about white supremacy, data models, and surveillance. And so that's my focus right now.
I'm about to graduate and a little bit in that kind of big unknown, but I hope that whatever I'm doing would give me the ability to keep thinking about data and civil liberties and justice issues related to particularly computing, but a wide range of issues. And so it's been great kind of starting off point. And I know I'll be thinking about this stuff and whatever I'm doing moving forward.
Let's see. The very next thing I'm going to be doing probably will be taking a child to a baseball practice. But aside from that, I am looking for opportunities to continue this kind of work, and thinking through. Elizabeth, you had mentioned the where does our energy usage go, and that was a thing that we had looked at early on, and I think that's a really interesting space for possibility, right? Both in terms of what practices, right, are being what activities are consuming how much energy, but also how those things are co-located with other kinds of inequities, right? So I just recently wrote a piece on COVID and dashboards and vaccine signups, right? And thinking about the dependency of the US COVID response on high-speed internet, and how that means that we have a really unequal usage of energy for particular kinds of digital streaming leisure practices, right? As opposed to, say, like health access, relatively low bandwidth practices. Being able to think through some of that is something that I'd like to spend some time on. And then, this topic of sort of like how do we tell the stories with the data such that they're able to break through, right? I mean, I think both racial justice and climate justice, and also probably gender justice, those are kind of a triumvirate of spaces where we need more than just the data, right? And the sort of the presentation in its traditional form, even if it's got a really charismatic speaker, is not getting through to everybody, right? And the climate scientists in particular have been worried about this and working on this for a long time. But I think in all three domains, there's some real opportunities for thinking through how embodied practices, how arts practices, whether it's performance or installation or sound or song, how those might bring some of these really urgent issues to people that have otherwise felt that they were untouched, even if, right, it's certainly impacting their lived opportunities as well.
Well, and I just want to thank you all for producing this work, for engaging in this conversation. I mean, we're always looking to broaden the ways we interact with ourselves, with the world, interest other people in the energy space in different ways, because we appreciate that for, like you said, I mean, no one really has a time to sit down with the IPCC report unless that's what you do. And so giving different people different ways to access these conversations, I'm just so grateful that you've been able to use these different modalities and tie us into a very different embodied conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much for the audience. And again, super clapping to you all for a great presentation and a new way of making us all think and feel energy.
Thank
Take
you
care.
for the opportunity.